morning to all. Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Ministers, the head table, ladies and gentlemen. Liat was on very good behavior today. I got here reasonably on time. And I'm very happy to be here. The last 24 years of my life as governor of the Central Bank, I have gotten to love this place very much because I've spent, I think, most of my working hours having to deal with the many of the issues that have arisen in this country. And I do not regret it because it has been a tremendous lesson to me and my colleagues at the bank, how you have to be persistent in treating with the issues which you confront. The issues are not solved overnight. You must really have a lot of persistence, perseverance, and discipline to treat with economic issues of the magnitude that we face in this small currency union. I would like to express my appreciation to the government of Antigua and Barbuda for inviting me to address this consultation. There's been a very welcome trend in the currency union, as governments have for the past few years been holding such events prior to the presentation of the national budget. This augurs well for the future, as the citizens of these islands can and are being informed of the policies which will affect them and can voice their opinions on these matters. This can lead to vigorous debates which give rise to alternative views on the path to the future. Two ingredients, in my humble opinion, would add considerable value to this trend. Firstly, that objective and independent bodies and individuals join the debate so that they go beyond political joustings between the political establishment. This would mean the strengthening of civil society, which could mean as well private sector and civil society doing their own research and join in the debate. Many of us refuse to join the debate and engage in mindless criticism. But what the country needs is a consensus around objectively discussed and debated options which face communities. Secondly, since we now belong to both a currency union and an economic union, that the press and other means are used to share these debates across the member countries. There's so much that we can learn from each other in sharing the knowledge and the debates. As you go through country by country, you find that many countries are doing a lot of good things, but the others have to find them in newspapers and in odd conversations, and therefore lots of time is spent reinventing the wheel. When I listen to all the programs in the documentary, they're all very good, and I'm sure will have a benefit. But what we see, both in this island and all the other islands, are wheels spinning within wheels, and the wheels not connected, and therefore you will not get the full benefit of all these very good things that are happening. I have attended such events in St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, in the last month, and I was invited to St. Lucia, but could not make it because of a prior commitment. On these occasions, I speak from a currency union, realistic and philosophical point of view, in keeping with the central bank's position in these arrangements. Because all of us get very enthusiastic about these things, either positively or negatively. Our job at the central bank is to maintain a calm and objective stance. As they say in the United States, when the party is really going, the central bank steps in and takes away the drinks. In the first instance, I have reminded and pointed out to my audiences on all occasions, which they have no doubt already know, that we are at the crossroads of our economic history, given the prevailing and ongoing circumstances under which we live at this time. Never in our history, or that of the international community, have we had a crisis as severe as this since the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933. And, people, I think, don't comprehend as time passes, I mean, how deep this crisis was. United States of America, for example, in big trillions were being spent. And what we central bankers say about these things, if you don't go over the brink, you assume that everything is okay. But going over the brink, for those of us who had to stare at this brink, knew what a dangerous place the world was in 2007, 2008. Now you hear all sorts of criticisms, people should have done this, people should have done that. If you're not sitting at the seat at the time, you really don't comprehend how dangerous these things are. We've had to face this crisis, having been unable since our independence to restructure our economies. Antigua and Barbuda, as well as the other members of ECCU, have the structural characteristics of being extremely small, open, and vulnerable economies. This imposes some major constraints on our development, depending on the mode of development which we choose. The global economy, there are three scenarios which we can think of at this point. First, that the global economy continues in its low growth, high unemployment mode, particularly in our main trading partners. And the ECCU countries continue with their current policies. That is not a good way to go. The global economy does not return to its pre-crisis levels, but the ECCU makes significant policy adjustments, which we have to make. Adjustment is inevitable. If there's any change in your lifestyle or in your country or in community, there has to be a countervailing policy or choice to deal with these things. The global economy goes through substantial restructuring and rebalancing, and the ECCU undergoes substantial socio-economic transformation, so that when the world economy does turn around, to remain competitive, we will have to do a lot of things which are fundamental to our very survival. Therefore, four outcomes are possible for the ECCU countries depending on their policy choices. We can become failed or failing states. We can go through what they call bare-bone survival. They can be moderate progress. But our aim needs to be socio-economic transformation. The points set out above lead us to four major policy challenges: financial stability, consolidation and development, debt management, fiscal reform, and growth and competitiveness. The reality of our situation comes back to the structural characteristics outlined above, which combine with what I will term two fundamental deficits, namely the supply-demand and the resource expectations deficits, constrain our growth and development prospects, if they are not properly addressed both politically and economically. What is our reality? We have narrow resource bases and low productivity economies. In very practical and arithmetic terms, let us take Antigua's population. The population is about 83,000. To get the economically active population, one must deduct those under 18 and those above 70. The number of un- and unemployed people must be factored in. The education profile and the health indices must be taken into consideration. So, for example, what we have are education profiles, where at the top there are a lot of highly educated people, but as you go towards the bottom, it flattens out, and the level of productivity is not very high because of the skills. The health indices. When I was discussing this with the chief statistician in St. Lucia, I said to him, he was telling me NCDs, of course, which are quite expensive and take a lot of time out of work. But the simple flu can keep someone at home for a week. And that's 40 working hours. 40 working hours. Finally, the impact of cultural factors and management practices. Many of us in this region do not like to go to work on time and like to leave work before we should. That does not add up to high priority. So if you take these things into consideration and you juxtapose them to countries like Korea, highly skilled people, lots of capital, they work from 7 to 7. There's no way that you can compete in that environment. The amount of arable land is not enough to be self-sufficient in food. Therefore, most of it is imported. And even if we could produce more food, it might be counterproductive to engage in trying to provide all the food that we have. We don't have the resources. We have not used the sea. In fact, the resource we have the most of is actually the sea. And if you go to Japan, they will tell you, be islands as well, that the sea is one of the major resources that is available. But I understand in this region, even some fishermen can't swim. We live geographically in close proximity to the most advanced consumer society in the world, the United States of America. And this defines our own consumption habits. And so therefore, and this is where the resource, the supply-demand deficit comes in. With the economic base that we have, it is very difficult to attain that standard of living on the resources we have. But in addition to that, we have multi-party competitive political systems in which it has become the norm that promises are made beyond the capacity of the economic system to deliver. And those two things are very, very fundamental to our well-being. And therefore, they have to be managed, both politically, socially, and economically. We have to ingrain in ourselves that we cannot spend consistently more than we earn. And therefore, both in the political system and the economic system, there must be serious attempts to manage these deficits. That is what has led in all of the countries to excess debt. These two circumstances put great strain on our balance of payments, and you can see the difference between imports and exports, the difference between from here to the moon, and our budgets. And unless we manage our expectations and increase our productivity, we will not be able to develop our economies. The binding constraints come from two very simple but seemingly misunderstood facts. Governments can only spend from the taxes they collect. Governments can only spend from the taxes they collect. So if you need a service, and everybody apparently needs something from the government, then it has to be paid for, unless you're given these services for free. And in the case of banks, banks can only lend from the deposits placed by them with the public. And these are two fundamental things that, if we don't understand, will get our countries into trouble as they have. In the case of the government, significant demands are placed, especially in developing countries, where infrastructure and social needs are great. Borrowing is critical for such governments, especially where concessional loans and grants have been declining. However, the ability to borrow depends on the creditworthiness of the government, which in turn depends on its track record of paying its creditors. If you do not pay those you borrow from, they will not lend you in the future. You can do that once, twice, but no creditor is stupid enough to lend you the third time. The management of its debt is one of the most critical tasks and functions of every government, because every government has to borrow. And one of the things that we have urged in the central bank is to have units in each government which pay day-to-day skilled attention to managing the debt of these countries. With respect to banks, they facilitate private spending for consumption as well as investment. Since the private sector is the engine of growth, there must be a balance between lending for household and personal consumption and facilitating production, particularly for export in our case. The ability of one minister to repay loans can have a very negative effect on the economic and financial system. So that those two things, I reiterate, are extremely critical to the progress of an economy and a system. Let us now address the budget system and the public finances. The revenue of the government comes from some critical revenue headings which can be labeled tax and non-tax. Taxes are set out by the Tax Commission, can be classified as personal income taxes, corporate taxes, excise taxes. These are affected by three factors: the growth of the economy, which is tied to the performance of the international economy; domestic tax policies, where you should tax, who you should tax; and the efficiency and effectiveness of tax administration. Now, there are hordes of taxes on the books, but they are not collected. It seems rather counterproductive to be putting more taxes when you haven't collected the taxes which are already there. With taxation, one has to be very careful that one takes enough to do the government's work, but not too much that there's a disincentive to people who produce. Government expenditure depends on how the government of the day sees the role of the state. The role varies from completely laissez-faire to completely controlled. The situation in the Caribbean is characterized as what can be described as an overstretched state. There are so many demands placed on the government that is unable both financially, technically, and administratively to fulfill these needs. This is clearly consistent with the high debt ratios. This therefore needs a change not only in the government, but in the rest of the participating elements in the society, that is the private sector and civil society. The private sector and civil society have to do as much as they can to remove some of the strain from the government. Sometimes it becomes very self-fulfilling in recent times. Every time somebody wants to do something, the first thing they do is go to the government. Minister Skeleton Syndicates describes it as, instead of going to the government with your hands open like this, go to the government with your hand touché. That means a partnership. So that if the strain is not taken up by employment generated by the private sector, and there's a big back and forth about this because people say, well, the government is not doing enough, not incentives, no business environment. But that the government and the private sector have to sit down to fix. If one looks at the items on the expenditure headings, what is very evident is a high level of employment in the public sector. This makes the state the employer both first and last resort. One can presume that if the public sector is so enlarged, that the level of output will be low, and the cost of provision of public service so high as to have a negative impact on productivity. Public employment is financed by taxation, which is the cost to the taxpayer, either as a household or a firm. The conundrum facing the government is that if the private sector is not creating jobs, then they seem to have to take up the slack through public employment or social welfare programs. Public employees need materials to work with, and there's usually a mismatch if there's overemployment leading either to waste or inefficiency. You may have teachers in classes who are chalk or blackboards or whatever. Transfers and subsidies are incurred either to stimulate business or to provide for the underprivileged. These programs have to be managed carefully as they can lead to waste and corruption. Now, I want to come to what has happened over the past several years in Antigua and Barbuda. And here I speak extemporaneously because what has happened in this country has been extremely fundamental in terms of the early model of development, which was based on an open system, lots of tax incentives, low taxes, and a lot of expenditure in a number of areas. When you look at the numbers over the years, the way budgets were done, which were highly inflated in some cases, from way back, and in one of the documents I have, there was a start to adjustment around 1984. And one could see the numbers going in a certain direction where you knew there had to be an adjustment. You cannot have expenditures which are not financed by taxation or financed through transfers from social security and other elements. And while there were a lot of good infrastructure projects, you could see the system winding down. And then there were these severe hurricanes in the late 1990s, and of course the global crisis, which hit every country in this region, except the oil producers. And then, as they say, when the tide is in, you can swim naked. When it goes out, you export. And we were all exposed. All the structural factors then came into play. And the pendulum always swings. The pendulum always swings. If it's on this side, to get to the middle, it has to go before it comes back. And therefore, an adjustment was inevitable. And the adjustment took the form that has taken over the past several years. And our colleague from the CDB has really very clearly identified the process. As my father used to say, as an individual, you can borrow so much, but there's a limit. As a firm, you can borrow until the profits really disappear. As a government, you can go a little further, because he said to me, the government can tax people, and it has land to sell. But there is an end. There always is an end, and you have to come back to the center. But before you come back to the center, that's how equilibrium goes. You have to go back. And so therefore, there has been a makeup, right, in the sense that we've had to take from the future, in a sense, to balance the present, to go back to the future. And Antigua is one of those classic cases, because Antigua experienced a lot of growth hitherto. But there's such a thing as overexpansion. We've seen it not only in countries, we've seen it in banks. We've had to intervene 4 banks in this jurisdiction because of the overexpansion. As you say, things always come back to the middle. And so, once you now get back to the middle, the question is, what do you do next? Because you have experienced the harsh adjustment that brings you back to the middle. And therefore you have to set policies that say, this is not the right road to go. And so therefore you have to build a platform for moving forward. Now, one of the things when you look at the structural things has to do with what is possible. Now, I enumerated the population. Is there enough critical mass in 83,000 people to move forward? Well, we've seen the numbers. The answer is no, despite all the many projects. But the governments in their wisdom have said, well, let us move to an economic union where we can aggregate those resources, and then we can, in a sense, strengthen ourselves inwardly and then proceed into the CARICOM and into the international community with this increased mass in order to penetrate with competitive industries, and I know competitive industries, in areas where we can get foreign exchange. Because that is the key. And our first colleague who spoke, Mr. Ryan, he said it very clearly. When you say tourism, you're thinking of foreign exchange. And as the day follows the night, in April at the Central Bank, we see a sudden drop in economic activity and foreign exchange flows. And that continues until November. So you have a long interregnum where you have to, in a sense, paddle before you get back there. It would mean that you have to take the surpluses, right, in the period when you have them, to balance out in between. But there's no way that year after year you can pretend as if there is not this interregnum. And so therefore we have to be very sensible about our economic policies in the future. We have to increase our productivity, and we have to increase our penetration into the rest of the regional international economy. It is absolutely vital and essential. We have to share services across the islands. We have to make sure that the private sector, in a sense, changes in structure. Right now, the private sector is mainly wholesale, resale, real estate, and construction, which is non-tradables. We have to have a serious export capability, And as well, we have to have very strong negotiating positions to get ourselves into markets which we now can access. So I would say, in large part, that we have done a lot of things over the last 4 or 5 years of this crisis. It's unbelievable what has been done. It's not obvious to the public, but I put it to you, if these things had not been done, there could very well have been a collapse of a lot of things in this region. So that it didn't happen is not to say that it couldn't happen, because it could happen. But of course you have to adjust and take the measures to ensure that you don't have a collapse of economies, your qualities, and your society. And that is why meetings like this are so very important. There must be a lot of sober thought brought to this meeting. We have to look the facts in the face. We have to do the arithmetic. I mean, I say publicly in this region, arithmetic is either badly thought or not understood. People think that subtraction and division are superior to addition and multiplication. But from the beginning, you understand that. But we seem to take great pleasure in subtracting and dividing things, and are surprised by the outcome. So, no wonder the math results are so poor at the CXC. But we have to change that. The other thing, I mean, again, this is geometry now, parallel lines never meet. And therefore, we have a lot of people in each country going their own sweet way, not meeting, not talking to each other, not understanding that we have to interact if we are to make progress. So, I thank you for inviting me. We have to speak honestly to each other, but we also have to have the good of our countries in mind, always, because these are very nice places. And I have no intention to surrender them to the IMF, the World Bank, or anybody who thinks they know better than us how to run our own places, despite the new change in environment. I mean, we are members, so we have to work with them. But we have to remember as well that we are very bright and capable people and can do a lot of things. So let's stop doubting ourselves and get down to the business of running these places for future generations. I thank you.